The land was a canvas of ochre and burnt sienna, stretched taut beneath a sky of infinite, unblinking blue. It was a place of stark truths, where life and death were painted in bold, unforgiving strokes. The sun, a merciless sovereign, reigned over the cracked earth, and the wind whispered ancient stories through the sparse, skeletal canyons. It was in this formidable theatre that a young woman named Anaba moved, not as a conqueror, but as a part of the landscape itself. She was a paradox, a living bridge between two worlds that refused to meet. From her father, Chief Kale of the Ashiwi people, she had inherited the sharp, knowing eyes that could read the subtle language of the earth, and skin the color of rich copper. From her mother, a settler woman taken by fever years ago, she wore a simple, tarnished silver armband on her left wrist, a silent testament to a love that had defied borders. This duality marked her as an outsider among her own kin. She was a whisper of a world they feared, a reminder of the encroachment of the new ones. Her heart, however, beat with the steady, resilient rhythm of the Ashiwi. She was navigating a narrow gorge, her moccasins making no sound on the stone, when a cry, thin and desperate, sliced through the profound silence. It was a human sound, raw with terror, and it came from the treacherous mudflats to the east, a place the elders called the Sunken Moor, where the earth could swallow a man whole. Caution was the law of this land, but compassion was the law of her heart. She broke into a run, her black hair a silken banner streaming behind her, the silver armband catching the brutal sunlight. What she was running toward, she could not know, but it was a decision that would forever alter the destiny of the unforgiving land she called home. She found him sunk to his chest in the glistening, greedy earth. He was a settler, that much was clear from his dust-caked denims and his wide-brimmed hat, which lay half-submerged beside him. He was a large man, not just tall but broad, with a powerful chest and shoulders that spoke of a life of hard labor, a constitution that the Ashiwi might have described as too sturdy, or that his own people might have called chubby. It was this very solidity that now worked against him, his weight causing him to sink faster into the quicksand's inexorable embrace. Panic was a wild animal in his eyes, and he flailed uselessly, his movements only serving to drag him deeper. Anaba stopped at the edge of the stable ground, her presence a sudden, calm intrusion into his frantic struggle. He saw her, and a flicker of something new crossed his face, not hope, but a bewildered resignation. He likely expected her to watch him perish, another casualty of a land that did not want him. Instead, she spoke, her voice steady and clear, carrying over the sucking sounds of the mud. "Do not fight it," she commanded, the formal cadence of her people lending her words an authority that belied her years. "The moor grows hungry when you struggle," he froze, his blue eyes locking onto her. She began to work with practiced efficiency, uncoiling the long leather rope from her shoulder. Finding a sturdy, deep-rooted outcrop of rock, she secured one end, her knot swift and sure. Then, inching carefully along a line of partially exposed stones, she cast the other end toward him. "Take it," she ordered. "Be slow. Let the earth release you." He did as he was told, his desperation now tempered by a fragile trust. It was a grueling process, a battle of patience against physics, of her quiet strength against the land's immense gravity. For what felt like an eternity, man and woman were locked in a silent, strenuous communion, pulling and pausing, until finally, with a great, gulping sigh, the mud relinquished its prize. He collapsed onto the solid ground, gasping, covered in a thick coat of grey clay, utterly spent. He lay there for a long time, the sun baking the mud on his skin into a cracked shell, his breath coming in ragged heaves. Anaba waited, her posture one of serene patience, her eyes watchful. She offered him water from her clay flask, and he drank deeply, the gratitude in his gaze more profound than any words could be. When he could finally speak, his voice was hoarse. "My name is Elias," he said, pushing himself into a sitting position. "You saved my life." "I am in your debt." Anaba simply nodded, accepting his statement as a fact, not a compliment. In her culture, a life debt was a sacred bond, an unbreakable thread woven into the fabric of honor. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time beyond his immediate peril. He was not a fearsome figure, despite his size. His face, beneath the grime, was open and earnest, his expression devoid of the hardened suspicion she so often saw in the eyes of the settlers who pushed ever further into Ashiwi territory. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his question genuine, born of a world where such an act of cross-cultural kindness was a profound anomaly. "You heard a cry," she replied, her answer both simple and deeply complex. "It is the way of my people to answer." She said nothing of her mother, or of the silver armband that felt cool against her skin, a constant reminder of the other blood that flowed within her veins. She helped him to his feet, his powerful frame unsteady, and guided him back toward the trail that led to the settlers' distant ranches. Before he departed, he turned back to her. He had nothing to offer, no coin or trinket. All he possessed was his word. "I will repay this," he vowed, his voice ringing with a solemnity that resonated in the vast, empty air. "I swear it on my name. You will see me again." He mounted his horse, which had been tethered safely away from the moor, and rode away. Inaba watched him go, a solitary figure shrinking against the horizon, a seed of an unknown future planted in the barren dust. She felt a deep and unsettling premonition, a sense that the ripples from this one act were destined to become a great wave. For 3 days, an unnatural quiet descended upon the valley. The wind ceased its whispering, and the birds seemed to hold their songs in abeyance. It was a silence that felt heavier than sound, a stillness pregnant with unspoken tension. Inaba carried the secret of her encounter like a smooth, heavy stone in her heart. She told no one, not even her father, Chief Kale. To speak of aiding a settler, one of the Iron Men as the warriors called them, would be to invite scorn and suspicion. A young warrior named Torin, whose ambition burned as hot as the midday sun, had been stoking the fires of fear. He spoke of the settlers' hunger for land, their fences that cut the earth like scars, and their rifles that spoke with a voice of thunder. His words found fertile ground in the anxious hearts of the tribe, who saw their way of life shrinking with each passing season. Torin often looked at Inaba with a particular disdain, his eyes lingering on her silver armband as if it were a brand of betrayal. He saw her not as a bridge, but as a crack in their people's resolve. During this tense waiting period, Inaba felt her isolation more keenly than ever. She would sit with her father in the evenings, the firelight dancing on his wise, lined face, and ached to share her burden. But she could not. She had acted from her own conscience, a place that existed in the space between her father's world and her mother's, and she would have to bear the consequences alone. On the morning of the 3rd day, the stillness was broken. It began as a low, almost imperceptible vibration in the soles of her feet, a tremor that spoke of a great weight in motion. Then came the sound, a distant, rhythmic drumming that was not thunder. A lookout's cry rang out from the high mesa, sharp with alarm. A dust cloud, vast and menacing, was rising from the west, a roiling brown plume against the pristine blue sky. It was moving toward their village, and it was moving fast. The village erupted into a controlled chaos. Warriors, their faces set in grim lines, grabbed bows and lances. The air, once silent, now filled with the sharp cries of command and the worried murmurs of women gathering their children. Torin was at the forefront, his voice loud and clear, a clarion call for battle. "It is the Iron Men," he shouted, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and ferocious excitement. "They come to wipe us from the land. We must meet their iron with our spirit." Chief Kale emerged from his lodge, his presence a calming anchor in the swirling tide of panic. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the approaching cloud of dust, his expression unreadable. Inaba's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of dread. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who was coming. It was Elias. He had sworn he would return, but she had never imagined this. An army. Had his vow of repayment been a lie, a cruel deception to learn the way to their hidden village? Was his earnest gratitude merely a mask for a conqueror's ambition? The questions tore at her, her hope battling with a rising tide of despair. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into distinct shapes. Horses and men, a multitude of them, their forms shimmering in the heat haze. 100, the lookout called down. 100 armed men. The number settled over the village like a death shroud. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Torin and a score of warriors formed a defensive line at the edge of the village, their bodies painted with the symbols of war, ready to die for their homes. Inaba looked from their defiant, desperate faces to her father's somber profile. His wisdom was a powerful force, but it could not stop bullets. In that moment, a terrible choice presented itself to her. She could stand with her people, fight, and perish. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could walk toward the approaching army, armed with nothing but a memory of an honest look in a desperate man's eyes. Her decision was not born of logic, but of a desperate, flickering faith. She remembered the solemnity in Elias's voice, the complete absence of guile in his eyes as he swore his oath. It was a fool's hope, perhaps, but it was the only hope she had. While Torin rallied the warriors for a final stand, Anaba turned and walked back to her family's lodge. She ignored the confused and angry stares. Inside, she stood for a moment in the cool dimness, her hand instinctively going to the carved hawk pendant that hung around her neck, a gift from her father symbolizing clarity of vision. Her fingers then brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the silver armband from her mother. They were two halves of herself, a heritage of peace and a heritage of progress, two worlds at war both outside the village and within her own soul. Today, she would force them to meet. She walked out of the lodge and directly toward the line of warriors. Torin saw her and barked, "Get back, half-blood." This is no place for a woman, but she did not falter. She walked past him, her gaze fixed on the approaching riders who had now slowed, their forms becoming clearer. She could see the glint of sun on rifle barrels, the determined set of their jaws. Her steps were steady, her back straight. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but she forced her feet forward, one after the other, across the open ground that separated the two armed camps. She was a solitary, small figure in a vast, tense landscape, a fragile bridge being extended over a chasm of imminent violence. The fate of her people, and perhaps his, rested on this desperate gamble. She was walking into the heart of the storm, praying she could calm the winds. It is in such moments, where a single soul chooses courage over fear, that history itself holds its breath. And for those of you watching, if you believe in the power of one person to make a difference, ensure you are subscribed to our channel for more stories of quiet, world-changing heroism. The drumming of hooves slowed to a walk, then ceased altogether. A line of 100 horsemen sat watching her, a silent, intimidating wall of leather and steel. The space between them crackled with an almost physical tension. From the center of the line, one rider moved forward. It was Elias. He dismounted, handing his reins to the man beside him. He was no longer the mud-caked, desperate man from the sunken moor. He was cleaned and dressed in sturdy clothes, his bearing one of authority. He walked toward her, his expression serious, his eyes searching her face. Anaba stopped a dozen paces from him, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She stood her ground, her chin held high, the silver armband on one arm and the symbols of her tribe on her buckskin dress creating a portrait of deliberate duality. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Behind her, she could feel the burning eyes of Torin and the warriors. Ahead, the cold, wary stares of 100 armed men. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I told you I would repay my debt," he said, his tone formal and resonant. It was not the greeting of an invader. "I have returned to honor my word." He gestured behind him, and several men dismounted, leading pack mules laden with heavy bundles. They were not carrying weapons of war, but sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, tools of iron, and crates of provisions. "A man's honor is his most valuable possession," Elias continued, his gaze unwavering. "You saved my life. Such a debt cannot be repaid with a few trinkets. It must be witnessed. I have brought my entire ranching outfit, every man who works for me, not as an army, but as witnesses to my gratitude. They are here to see me honor the woman who showed me mercy when she could have left me to die." He had brought 100 armed men not as a threat, but as a testament. The sheer scale of his gesture was meant to convey the depth of his sincerity. It was a catastrophic, almost fatal misunderstanding, born from two cultures with vastly different ways of expressing honor and intent. Torin and the other warriors watched, their faces a mixture of disbelief and deep-seated suspicion. "It is a trick!" Torin's voice was a harsh rasp, filled with a venomous certainty. "They show us gifts with one hand, while the other holds a rifle. They mean to lull us into complacency and then strike." His fear was a poison, spreading quickly among the others who had been raised on tales of the settlers' treachery. They saw not a gesture of profound respect, but a Trojan horse, a clever ruse before the inevitable slaughter. The warriors gripped their weapons tighter, their knuckles white. The settlers, in turn, saw the Ashiwi's reaction not as fear, but as aggression. They shifted in their saddles, their hands moving instinctively closer to their own weapons. The fragile piece, just moments old, was already beginning to fracture. Anaba saw the chasm of misunderstanding widening with every passing second, threatening to swallow them all. She knew she was the only one who could bridge it. She turned, her back to Elias, and faced her own people. She looked directly at Torin, her gaze unflinching. "Your eyes see only the past, Torin," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power. "You are so blinded by old fears that you cannot see the truth standing before you." She raised her left arm, the silver armband gleaming. "This is the world you fear." Then she touched the hawk pendant at her throat. "And this is the world you know. I am of both. I tell you now, the man behind me speaks with an honest heart. His actions are clumsy, and his ways are not our ways, but his intent is honor." She then turned back to face Elias, her expression softening. "And you," she said, her voice now softer, but no less firm. "You must understand that 100 armed men do not look like witnesses to my people. They look like an army of death. Your show of honor is seen as a declaration of war." She stood directly between them, a lone arbiter in a field of simmering violence, her words a final, desperate attempt to translate the language of fear into the language of reason. It was the moment of truth. The fate of two peoples rested upon a knife's edge, balanced on the courage of one woman who belonged fully to neither. Chief Kale had been watching silently from the edge of the village, his ancient eyes absorbing every word, every gesture. He had seen the fear in Torin's face and the sincerity in the stranger's. But most of all, he had seen the astonishing strength in his daughter. He saw her not as a half-blood, but as a complete soul, embodying the wisdom to see beyond the surface of things. As the tension reached its breaking point, he began to walk forward, his steps slow and deliberate. He carried no weapon. In his hands, he held the tribe's most sacred object, the ceremonial peace pipe, its stone bowl carved in the likeness of an eagle, its stem adorned with the feathers of a hawk. He walked past Torin, offering a silent, stern rebuke with his eyes, and came to stand beside his daughter. He looked at Elias, his gaze deep and piercing, as if searching for the man's very soul. "The words of my daughter are wise," Chief Kale declared, his voice a low rumble that commanded immediate respect from all who heard it. "Fear has built a wall between our peoples. Today, we have a chance to tear it down." He turned to Elias and extended the pipe. "Your gesture, though frightening in its form, was born of honor. We will receive it in the spirit it was intended. But gifts of flour and iron cannot build a lasting peace. Trust is built not with goods, but with understanding." Elias looked from the chief to the sacred pipe, his expression one of awe and dawning comprehension. He recognized the profound significance of the offer. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust with a soft thud. He then gestured for his men to lower their rifles. One by one, with murmurs of surprise and relief, they did so. He had come to repay a debt and, in doing so, had been offered a chance to build a future. The air, once thick with the promise of violence, slowly began to clear. Chief Kale lit the pipe, the fragrant smoke of sacred herbs rising in a thin, prayerful column into the vast blue sky. He took a puff, then offered it to Elias. The settler leader accepted it with a steady hand, his face a mask of solemn respect. He drew from the pipe and passed it back, the ancient ritual of peace unfolding in the space between two worlds. This single act, witnessed by all, was more powerful than any weapon. It was a promise, a treaty, a bridge built of smoke and breath and shared humanity. Torin and his followers watched, their aggression slowly dissolving into a grudging, confused silence. They could not fight a man who had laid down his arms and accepted the pipe of peace. The crisis had passed. The release of tension was palpable, like a great collective exhale. The gifts were brought forward and accepted, not as payment, but as the first exchange in a new relationship. Anaba stood beside her father, her heart filled with a profound and aching relief. The heavy stone of her secret had been transformed into the cornerstone of a new era. She was no longer an outsider caught between two worlds. In that moment, by choosing to trust and by daring to speak, she had become the architect of a shared future. She had not just saved a man from the sunken earth, she had saved two peoples from the quicksand of their own hatred and fear. A single act of kindness had returned not as a wave of destruction, but as a tide of hope, reminding us that the courage to understand is the most powerful force on earth. And as we reflect on this powerful conclusion, we invite you to tell us where you're watching from in the world. It is a joy to know that these stories of unity and courage are reaching so many corners of the globe. Thank you for being a part of our community, and for supporting Tales That Matter.